The letter arrived water-stained and smelling of lavender. Nathaniel Reed sat by the window of his small log cabin, paper trembling in his rough hands. After 8 years of silence, he'd written to a mail-order bride service in a moment of weakness. Now Miss Caldwell would arrive in 3 days. When the stagecoach rumbled into Silverdale, Nathaniel froze at the sight of her. Small and slender in a travel-stained blue dress, she lifted her veil to reveal a face marked by a dark bruise and healing cut. She fumbled in her handbag, producing a note. Miss Caldwell has suffered at the hands of those who should have protected her. She comes in need of safety more than marriage. Nathaniel looked at her, his voice steady. You're not alone now. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The letter arrived water-stained and smelling of lavender, and as Nathaniel Reed sat by the window of his small log cabin in the Montana Territory, the paper trembled in his rough hands while the spring wind carried the last bite of winter through the cracks in the walls. A stark reminder that he had lived alone for 8 long years, with silence as his closest companion. But this letter carried something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Having written to the mail-order bride service in a moment of weakness after a brutal winter, not expecting a reply, yet here it was, saying Miss Zoe Caldwell of Boston would arrive in Silverdale on the last Thursday of May, just 3 days from now, causing Nathaniel's heart to thud in a way it hadn't in years, as he worried whether she'd regret coming once she saw just a worn-out cowboy with nothing but a cabin and a few acres, muttering to himself, "What have I gone and done?" As the next days passed in a blur with Nathaniel cleaning every inch of the cabin until his knuckles bled, washing curtains, sweeping floors, and even trying to bake bread that came out hard as a horseshoe, borrowing a spare mattress from the general store and airing it out for her. And by Wednesday night, he stood before his cracked mirror trimming his beard and cutting his hair with a knife, the reflection showing a sun-worn man with deep lines around blue eyes. Not handsome maybe, but decent enough, he hoped. And Thursday dawned bright and clear as Nathaniel, dressed in his cleanest shirt and trousers, pulled on his good boots, and rode the 7 miles into Silverdale, a small town that was little more than a line of dust and wooden buildings, a saloon, a church, a general store, and a few scattered homes, where he tied his horse outside the stagecoach office, trying not to look as nervous as he felt, while Frank Wilson, who ran the stage line, greeted him with a knowing grin about his mail-order bride, to which Nathaniel could only mutter that news travels fast, and then the coach was late as usual, leaving Nathaniel pacing the platform with his hat twisting in his hands, every muscle tight as he contemplated turning back and sending a letter later saying he'd changed his mind. But just as he was about to leave, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon and the stagecoach rumbled into town, horses snorting and stomping as it came to a stop, the driver jumping down to toss a small trunk onto the platform before helping a woman step down, causing Nathaniel to freeze at the sight of her, small and slender, wearing a travel-stained blue dress and a simple hat with a veil, standing still and clutching her bag as her eyes scanned the crowd searching for someone, prompting Nathaniel to take a deep breath and step forward to ask, "Miss Caldwell?" in his rough voice, watching as the woman turned slowly and lifted her veil to reveal a face that might have been beautiful, delicate, pale, with eyes the color of spring grass, but marked by a dark bruise spreading across her cheek and a healing cut on her lip, answering quietly, "Yes, Mr. Reed," as he nodded, unable to take his eyes off her injuries until she noticed his stare and lifted a trembling hand to her cheek, whispering, "I can explain," while fumbling inside her handbag to pull out a folded note held toward him with the words, "You may wish to reconsider our arrangement," prompting Nathaniel to unfold the paper and read the careful, neat handwriting that explained Miss Caldwell had suffered at the hands of those who should have protected her and came to him in need of safety more than marriage, with an offer from the agency to refund his fee should he wish to end the arrangement. But as he lowered the letter, Zoe stood before him with downcast eyes, still as a frightened deer, and when he asked who did this to her, she simply replied it didn't matter now, and that she understood if he wished to dissolve their agreement. Yet Nathaniel really looked at her and saw that the bruises couldn't hide the strength in her eyes, or the faint tremor of hope in her voice, feeling something shift inside him as he handed the letter back and said, steady and sure, "Miss Caldwell, you're not alone now," watching surprise flicker across her face as she asked if he still wanted her as his bride. to which he simply responded that he wanted her to be safe, and the rest could wait, causing her shoulders to ease as she let out a small, shaky breath and thanked him softly, which he corrected to Nathaniel, prompting her to reply, "Zoe," her lips curving faintly despite the bruise. And then he picked up her trunk and nodded toward his horse, explaining his homestead was about 7 miles away and asking if she'd rather rest in town first. But Zoe glanced nervously at the few townsfolk watching them and said she'd rather not stay. So Nathaniel helped her mount the horse, careful not to touch her more than necessary, then climbed up behind her for the silent ride along the rough trail, feeling the stiffness in her back and the tension of someone used to flinching at any sudden move, until they reached the ridge overlooking his valley, where he pointed out his sturdy log cabin beside a clear creek, with a small barn and a young garden just beginning to sprout, apologizing that it wasn't much, though she replied it was lovely, and he thought maybe she meant it as he showed her the spare room inside. A simple bed, a small chest, a single window, explaining she would have her own space, though he knew it was plain, to which she quickly replied it was perfect before turning to meet his eyes, and explained that she came because she had nowhere else, that the agency had helped her when no one else would. But she didn't expect anything he wasn't willing to give, prompting Nathaniel to nod and promise that whatever happened before wouldn't happen here, that she was safe now, causing her lips to tremble as she nodded and confessed she wasn't used to kindness from men, to which Nathaniel's jaw tightened but his voice stayed calm as he assured her she'd get used to it. And that night, after a quiet supper, Zoe retired to her small room while Nathaniel lay awake across the cabin, listening to the soft creak of the mattress and the faint sound of her breathing, realizing for the first time in years, his cabin wasn't silent, and the loneliness that had haunted him had been replaced by something new, something fragile and uncertain, but alive, as he stared at the ceiling wondering what fate had brought a Dotatis, bruised, frightened woman from Boston to his lonely stretch of Montana territory. And the next morning broke warm and clear with Nathaniel rising early, trying to be quiet as he built a fire and started coffee, surprised when Zoe appeared dressed in a simple cotton dress with her hair tied back, greeting him softly, though he nodded, suddenly unsure what to say to this stranger in his house, hoping he hadn't woken her, to which she explained she was used to rising early and offered to help, leading Nathaniel to hesitate before explaining breakfast was usually just coffee and biscuits, sometimes eggs, watching as Zoe nodded and moved to the stove with cautious but determined movements, explaining she had cooked for a large household in Boston and could manage biscuits, reaching for the flour as her sleeve rose slightly to reveal more bruises circling her wrist like a bracelet, causing Nathaniel to look away, having seen violence before but finding it hit different on a woman, gruffly announcing he would see to the animals and heading for the door, returning later to a cabin filled with the smell of fresh biscuits as Zoe set the small table for their awkward, silent meal, until Nathaniel finally spoke to mention he had work to do in the Northfield and asked what she did besides cooking, watching as Zoe set down her coffee cup to explain she could sew, garden, preserve food, and keep accounts from her work as a housekeeper for a wealthy family in Boston, something in her tone making Nathaniel suspect that was where the bruises had come from, though he didn't press, instead suggesting the garden needed tending if she was interested since beans and squash were coming in and the weeds never quit, which seemed like a gift to her as she smiled and said she'd like that, truly smiled for the first time as the morning sun caught her eyes, and Nathaniel realized they were the prettiest shade of green he'd ever seen. And over the next few days they settled into a cautious rhythm with Nathaniel working the fields, mending fences, and checking on his small herd of cattle, while Zoe stayed close to the cabin, tending the garden and making the simple homestead more comfortable by hanging curtains she'd sewn from an old sheet, scrubbing floors until they gleamed, and arranging wildflowers in a jar on the table, with their nights spent eating together and sharing the day's events in polite conversation, as Nathaniel was careful to keep his distance, to move slowly and speak softly, having noticed how she flinched at sudden movements and watched doors and windows. Though as days passed, he observed the bruises fading and with them some of Zoe's fear as she began to relax, to laugh at his awkward jokes, to meet his eyes when they spoke. And one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Zoe spoke of her past for the first time, explaining that after her parents died, She went to live with her uncle in Boston, who found her a position as a maid in the Harrington household, where Mr. Harrington was wealthy and powerful, his wife often ill, and their son Charles had noticed her. Her voice steady, though her fingers twisted in her lap as she described how it started with small attentions, compliments, and gifts, then turned to demands, and when she refused, he grew angry, pausing as she stared at the distant mountains before continuing that the last time, he came to her room at night, drunk, and when she fought back, he beat her badly, touching her cheek where the bruise had faded to a yellow shadow. As she explained, the housekeeper found her the next morning and helped her escape through a service in Boston that helps women like her, women who need to disappear, arranging the bride agency. And Nathaniel sat in silence, absorbing her words and fighting the rage burning in his chest, before finally speaking gently to assure her she was safe here and no one would hurt her again. Watching as she looked at him, really looked, measuring the truth of his words before simply saying she believed him. And after that night, something shifted between them as Zoe began accompanying Nathaniel on his daily rounds, learning about the ranch, helping with the cattle, and asking questions about everything, taking over the garden completely and expanding it with herbs and flowers, proud when the first vegetables ripened under her care, while Nathaniel found himself watching her, the way she moved with growing confidence, tilted her head when she concentrated, and softly hummed when she thought no one was listening. And in the evenings, they sat together by the fire as Zoe read aloud from the few books Nathaniel owned, her voice bringing the stories to life in a way he'd never experienced, sometimes their hands brushing as they passed a cup or plate, with Nathaniel noticing she no longer flinched at his touch, until one evening, about a month after Zoe's arrival, a fierce storm blew in from the mountains, thunder cracking overhead as the cabin shook with the force of the wind, and rain pelted the roof like bullets, prompting Zoe to ask if it would hold and Nathaniel to assure her it had stood through worse, though he kept glancing at the door worried about the animals until a particularly violent crack of thunder shook the cabin and Zoe gasped, instinctively reaching for his hand, her fingers twining with his, warm and trembling, causing Nathaniel to freeze, surprised by the contact, before gently squeezing her hand and softly assuring her it was just a storm and they were safe. The summer air shimmered with heat as Nathaniel and Zoe rode into Silverdale, dust rising from beneath the horse's hooves, while Zoe sat straight in front of him, her hands gripping the saddle horn and her back pressed lightly against his chest, giving Nathaniel a moment to reflect on how far they'd come since that frightened woman stepped off the stagecoach, now displaying a quiet strength that impressed him daily, as they needed supplies for winter, flour, sugar, coffee, with Zoe having insisted on coming despite his concerns, telling him that morning, "I can't hide forever," which he reluctantly agreed to, though he didn't like the idea of her being stared at by curious eyes. And when they arrived at the general store, they were greeted by the storekeeper Jenkins, a round man with a curious smile who called out, "Well, if it isn't Reed and his mystery bride. We've been wondering when you two might show yourselves," causing Zoe's chin to lift slightly as she responded with quiet confidence, "It's Zoe Caldwell. We're taking time to know each other before making everything official," making Jenkins blink before chuckling that it was a sensible approach, he supposed, then leaning closer to add they would be the talk of the town for sure. But Zoe didn't flinch or hide behind Nathaniel, instead asking about the price of sugar and discussing the harvest like someone who'd lived there her whole life, while Nathaniel watched her with pride, realizing she was no longer the same woman who had stepped off that dusty coach months ago. And after completing their errands, they stopped at the small restaurant for lunch where Nathaniel ordered stew and watched Zoe sit across from him, the sunlight catching her hair and making it shine like gold, prompting him to say softly, "You look beautiful today," causing Zoe to blush in surprise before thanking him and explaining she wanted to make a good impression, to which he simply replied, "You already have." But before she could respond, a shadow fell across their table as Sheriff Tom Blackwood stood there, hat in hand and face serious, greeting Reed quietly and saying he'd hoped to catch him because he'd received a message from near Helena about someone asking after a young woman who sounded a lot like his wife, causing Nathaniel to feel Zoe freeze across from him as he asked who was looking for her, keeping his voice calm while the sheriff explained the man claimed to be her guardian, saying she had run away from Boston and was offering money to anyone who helped find her, making Zoe's hands tremble around her cup as she whispered, He's found me. Though the sheriff looked between them with a softening expression and assured them, if she's here of her own free will, she's safe as far as I'm concerned. But Reed, if I were you, I'd make things official. Men like that don't give up easy. And when the sheriff left, the small restaurant felt too quiet until Zoe broke the silence, her voice shaking as she said, "If we were truly married, he couldn't take me back," prompting Nathaniel to reach across the table and cover her hand with his, assuring her, "We'll do it when you're ready, Zoe. Not because of fear, but because you choose it." Watching her nod, though her eyes remained distant as she whispered, "I just want this to end," before they left town quickly with the weight of the sheriff's warning following them home, where for weeks afterward, Nathaniel kept his rifle close and his eyes open for strangers, though no one came while the mountain stood silent and the days passed in peace, and by late August, the fear had faded as the air cooled and leaves began turning gold, with Nathaniel and Zoe working side by side preparing for winter, their laughter returning along with something deeper and more tender between them, until one evening as the sky burned orange with sunset, Zoe sat beside him on the porch with her hands folded in her lap and quietly said, "I've been thinking," causing Nathaniel's heart to thud as he asked, "About us? What about us?" And Zoe turned to him with steady eyes to explain, "When I came here, I was broken. I didn't trust anyone. But you changed that. You gave me peace when I didn't think I deserved it. I care for you more than I ever thought I could care for anyone again," making Nathaniel's throat go dry as she simply stated, "I want to be your wife. Truly your wife," leaving him momentarily speechless before he reached for her hand, his rough fingers closing over her smaller ones as he admitted, "I care for you too. More than I know how to say. If you're sure, we'll do it," to which she whispered, "I'm sure," leading them to marry the next morning in the small church in Silverdale, with only the sheriff and pastor standing as witnesses, no flowers, music, or guests, just two people who had found each other in the wild heart of the West. And when the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel kissed her gently as Zoe smiled against his lips and said, "I think I finally know what home feels like," beginning months filled with a quiet joy Nathaniel had never known as they worked together through the fall, harvesting, preparing, and laughing, with Zoe's laughter coming easily now and sometimes causing Nathaniel to stop working just to listen to it, until one cold morning in October when Zoe told him she was expecting, causing Nathaniel to freeze and stare at her before breaking into a grin that reached his eyes and asking, "A baby?" as she nodded with a soft smile, confirming, "A baby," prompting him to pull her close and hold her tight against him while whispering, "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted," as winter arrived with heavy snow that locked them away from the world, though they didn't mind as they built a life inside those walls full of warmth and laughter, with Nathaniel making her tea every morning, and Zoe reading aloud by the fire every night while the baby grew strong beneath her heart, and Nathaniel often knelt beside her, listening for the small flutter of movement, until spring brought the thaw, and with it, the child, following a long night filled with pain and prayer that broke with dawn as Nathaniel held his daughter for the first time, tiny, perfect, and fierce with her mother's eyes and his chin, hearing Zoe whisper, "Amelia, after my mother," as he looked at his wife and their newborn child with tears filling his eyes and softly pronounced, "Amelia Reed, welcome home," while outside, the first rays of sunlight touched the Montana mountains, and the world seemed to hold its breath, prompting Nathaniel to wrap his arms around Zoe and the baby, his voice rough with emotion as he whispered again the words that had started it all. "You're not alone now. Not ever again." And years later, when the fields were full and their children played in the garden, Nathaniel sometimes thought back to that dusty day in Silverdale when a frightened woman stepped off a stagecoach and changed everything, knowing that in a land known for loneliness and hardship, they had found something rare. Not just survival, but love, family, and peace. And every night when the stars spread across the Montana sky, Nathaniel would whisper the same promise he'd made that first day, one that had never been broken. "We're not alone now. Not ever again," which was particularly meaningful considering how their journey had begun with such uncertainty, when Nathaniel was looking through that water-stained letter smelling of lavender that would change his life forever, bringing a wounded soul to his doorstep who needed protection, not realizing then that she would also fill the empty spaces of his heart and home with a brightness he had forgotten could exist in the world, creating a bond that went beyond the arrangement they had initially agreed to and blossomed into something genuine and lasting despite the threats that had followed them from her past, forcing them to face difficult decisions about their future together. Decisions that ultimately strengthened their connection, rather than weakening it as they chose each other freely rather than out of necessity or fear. Though the shadow of her past had certainly hastened certain aspects of their relationship, particularly the formal marriage that provided legal protection from those who might try to claim authority over her, with the sheriff's warning serving as both a reminder of the dangers still lingering in the world beyond their peaceful valley, and as a catalyst for honest conversations about what they truly wanted from their arrangement. Conversations that revealed feelings that had been growing quietly between them during those summer months of working side by side, sharing meals, and weathering storms together, both literal and emotional, as they built a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than mere convenience or obligation. So that by the time Zoe spoke those words on the porch, "I want to be your wife," truly your wife, they weren't just spoken out of fear of being found, but from a place of authentic desire to build a life together, which Nathaniel recognized in her eyes and voice, seeing beyond the lingering shadows of her trauma to the strength and determination that had carried her across the country to start anew, qualities he had come to admire deeply alongside her gentle nature and quiet grace, making their simple wedding ceremony in that small frontier church all the more meaningful despite its lack of traditional trappings. Because what mattered wasn't the outward display but the commitment they made to each other. A commitment that bore fruit in the months that followed as they settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both, finding joy in simple daily routines and shared work, culminating in the news of their expected child that transformed Nathaniel's world yet again, expanding his heart in ways he could never have imagined back when he was simply a lonely rancher, riding to a bride service in desperation after another solitary winter, not daring to hope for the family that now surrounded him. First with Zoe's arrival, then with their marriage, and finally with the birth of little Amelia in the spring, creating a cycle of renewal that paralleled the seasons of the Montana wilderness they called home, where harsh winters gave way to abundant springs and summers of growth and harvest, mirroring the trajectory of their relationship that had begun in the chill of fear and blossomed into the warmth of love, creating a narrative far richer than either could have scripted for themselves when they first met on that dusty platform in Silverdale, with Zoe veiled and trembling and Nathaniel uncertain of what he had gotten himself into, neither one anticipating how completely their lives would intertwine, or how the simple act of offering safety, "You're not alone now," would grow into a family bond stronger than any threat that might have pursued them. From Boston, stronger even than the brutal Montana winters or the challenges of frontier life, because they faced each challenge together, finding in their partnership a resilience neither possessed alone, transforming a marriage that began as protection into one founded on genuine love, respect, and shared purpose, allowing both of them to heal from past wounds, his grief over his lost brother and her trauma from abuse, as they built something new together in that small cabin beside the clear creek, surrounded by mountains that had once seemed to Nathaniel like silent witnesses to his loneliness, but now stood as guardians of his family's happiness. The same family that had seemed impossible when he first received that water-stained letter smelling faintly of lavender, not knowing then that hope would arrive on the stagecoach with a bruised face but an unbroken spirit, a spirit that matched his own in ways neither could have predicted but both came to treasure beyond measure. The months that followed their simple wedding were filled with a quiet joy Nathaniel had never known as they worked side by side through the fall, harvesting, preparing, and sharing laughter that echoed across their small valley, with Zoe's laughter coming so easily now that sometimes Nathaniel would stop working just to listen to it, a sound that seemed to heal something in him he hadn't realized was broken. Until one cold morning in October when Zoe approached him by the barn, her cheeks flushed not just from the crisp air but from something else, a secret joy visible in her eyes before she even spoke the words that would change their lives once more, simply telling him she was expecting, causing Nathaniel to freeze and stare at her in disbelief before breaking into a grin that reached his eyes, the corners crinkling as he asked in wonder, "A baby?" And she nodded, her smile soft and certain as she confirmed, "A baby." prompting him to pull her close against him, holding her tight, as if she might disappear if he let go, whispering against her hair, "You've given me everything I never knew I wanted." Words that carried all the emotion he couldn't express any other way, marking the moment their partnership transformed yet again from marriage into family, from two souls finding comfort in each other to creating a new life together. A life that grew strong beneath Zoe's heart through the winter months, as snow came heavy to the Montana territory, locking them away from the world in their small cabin. Though they didn't mind the isolation that once had been Nathaniel's greatest burden, now finding it a gift of uninterrupted time together as they built a life inside those walls full of warmth and anticipation. With Nathaniel establishing new routines like making Zoe tea every morning, carefully measuring the herbs she said would strengthen the baby, watching over her with a protectiveness that made her smile, even as she assured him she wasn't made of china. While their evenings took on a sacred quality with Zoe reading aloud by the fire from Nathaniel's few precious books, her voice bringing stories to life while the firelight danced across her features and turned her hair to gold, and Nathaniel found himself mesmerized not just by the tales but by the subtle changes in her body as the baby grew, often kneeling beside her chair to place his rough hand gently against the swell of her belly, his expression one of awe when he felt the first flutter of movement, a tiny kick that connected him to the miracle growing within her, a miracle they had created together in this remote wilderness where once he had known nothing but solitude. And as the winter deepened, so did their bond, with conversations about names and dreams for their child mingling with practical preparations. Nathaniel crafting a cradle from pine wood harvested from their land, carefully sanding every surface until it was smooth as silk, while Zoe sewed tiny garments from fabric they'd purchased in town, her nimble fingers creating delicate clothes for the baby they already loved beyond measure. Both of them finding themselves speaking to the child as if it could hear and understand their promises of love and protection, promises Nathaniel meant with his whole heart as he whispered to Zoe's belly late one night when he thought she was asleep, "You'll never be alone, little one. Not ever." Words that brought tears to Zoe's eyes, though she kept them hidden, touched by how completely this once solitary man had embraced becoming a father. And when the first signs of spring began to appear, tiny green shoots pushing through melting snow, birds returning to nest in the eaves of their cabin, they knew the time was drawing near, feeling both excitement and trepidation as they prepared for the arrival that would complete their family, gathering clean linens and sending word to the midwife in Silverdale who had promised to come when called, though Nathaniel worried about the still muddy roads and unpredictable weather of Montana springtime, fears that proved warranted when Zoe's labor began during a gentle but persistent rainfall that turned the trail to town into a river of mud, making it impossible for the midwife to reach them in time, forcing Nathaniel to face his greatest fear, that Zoe would need help he couldn't provide, that he might lose her just when their life together was truly beginning. But Zoe showed a strength that amazed him, breathing through the pains with determination, squeezing his hand until he thought the bones might break but never crying out, even as the night grew long and her face pale with exhaustion, whispering between contractions, "We'll be all right, Nathaniel. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time." Words meant to comfort him as much as herself as the night stretched endlessly before them, filled with pain and prayer and whispered encouragements until finally, as the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cabin windows, their daughter entered the world with a fierce cry that matched the first birdsong outside, and Nathaniel, with trembling hands that had never done anything so important, caught his child and placed her on Zoe's chest, both of them weeping at the sight of her, tiny, perfect, and fierce with her mother's eyes and his chin, as Zoe whispered through her tears, "Amelia, after my mother," the name falling perfectly into place as Nathaniel looked at his wife and their newborn child, tears filling his eyes while emotion closed his throat, only managing to say softly, "Amelia Reed, welcome home." As outside, the first rays of sunlight touched the Montana mountains, and the world seemed to hold its breath at the perfection of the moment, prompting Nathaniel to wrap his arms around Zoe and the baby, his voice rough with emotion as he whispered again the words that had started it all. "You're not alone now. Not ever again." A promise that expanded to include this new life they had created together, binding them as a family more completely than any legal document ever could. And as the days turned to weeks and months and years, they watched their daughter grow strong and wild as the Montana landscape itself, her laughter echoing across the fields that Nathaniel had expanded year by year, now growing not just enough for them but surplus to sell in town. The prosperity showing in the additions to their cabin, a new room for Amelia, glass windows that let in more light, a proper cook stove that Zoe declared the finest thing she'd ever owned. All signs of a life built through partnership and love. And when Amelia was 3, she was joined by a brother they named Thomas, after Nathaniel's twin, a sturdy boy with his father's quiet ways and his mother's kind heart. And 2 years after that came little Sarah, completing their family, as Nathaniel often remarked that his once silent cabin now rang with more voices and laughter than he could have imagined in his most hopeful moments. And sometimes, on summer evenings when the work was done and the children played in the garden, Zoe had expanded to include flowers purely for beauty's sake alongside the vegetables that fed them. Nathaniel would watch from the porch, pipe in hand, and think back to that dusty day in Silverdale when a frightened woman stepped off a stagecoach and changed everything, marveling at how a decision made in desperate loneliness had led to such fullness. To a home, overflowing with life and love in this land, known for its harshness and isolation, where they had found something rare and precious, not just survival, which was achievement enough on the frontier, but genuine happiness, family, and peace, a legacy they were building day by day for their children, teaching them not just how to work the land and care for animals, but how to care for each other, how to recognize the strength that can exist alongside gentleness, lessons Zoe and Nathaniel had taught each other through their years together, from those first awkward days of careful distance to the easy partnership they now shared, moving through their days in the synchronized rhythm of people who know each other's thoughts almost before they're spoken, who can communicate volumes in a single glance across a room full of children and activity, who still reach for each other's hand in the darkness of night, finding comfort in the familiar touch that once had been so tentative and now was as necessary as breathing. And when visitors came, more frequently now as the territory grew and their reputation for hospitality spread, they often remarked on the unusual warmth of the Reed home, not understanding that it had been built not just of logs and labor but of second chances and promises kept, particularly the promise Nathaniel whispered every night when the stars spread across the Montana sky. The same words he'd spoken that first day to a bruised and frightened woman, words that had become a family ritual as he tucked their children into bed, and then joined Zoe on the porch to watch the day's last light fade from the mountains that had witnessed their entire story. We're not alone now. Not ever again. A truth more profound than any other in their lives. The words that acknowledged how far they had come from the solitary man writing a desperate letter and the wounded woman fleeing a dangerous past to this family surrounded by prosperity they had built together, proving that even in the harshest wilderness, love could not only survive but flourish if tended with care. The way Zoe tended her garden and Nathaniel his fields, with patience and daily attention and faith in tomorrow. Faith that had been rewarded beyond anything either could have imagined when they first met as strangers bound by a mail-order arrangement and became partners in creating this rich tapestry of a life together, with its threads of hardship and joy, work and rest, woven into a pattern unique to them yet universal in its beauty. The story of two people who found in each other not just what they needed but what they never dared to dream possible. A home where loneliness could not enter, where past wounds could heal, and where the future stretched before them as vast and promising as the Montana sky, spangled with stars that seemed to affirm what they already knew in their hearts, that they had been brought together for a purpose greater than either could have fulfilled alone, creating in their union a strength and tenderness that would endure long after they were gone, living on in their children and their children's children. A legacy of love that had begun with 5 simple words spoken by a worn-out cowboy to a wounded woman on a dusty street. "You're not alone now," words that had changed everything.